Although most economists are generally supportive of the forces of trade, they readily admit that trade can cause dislocations and disruptions to an economy. Thus, there will always be political pressure to limit imports. Such steps are known generically as protectionism. This lecture will first review the overall economics of protectionism. That is, what are the economic effects on consumers and producers and the economy as a whole from limiting imports? Then, we'll consider many of the possible arguments for protectionism, along with the reasons that most economists find those arguments less than compelling. So let's start with a definition. Protectionism. Protectionism is the laws or rules that reduce or shut out imports. It's called protectionism because the stated intent of such laws is to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. There are various ways in which one could try and implement protectionism. For example, import quotas put a numerical limit on imports. They say quantitatively how much can be imported. Tariffs are a tax on imports. So you might say that each imported car or something has a 10% tax that's added. Voluntary export restraints are when two countries negotiate and one country agrees to reduce its exports to the other country. Now, such reductions are usually not very voluntary at all. They're sort of negotiated under the threat that if one country doesn't voluntarily reduce its exports, the other country will institute some sort of quota or tariff on imports. In the 1970s and 1980s, the United States went to Japan several times over Japan's steel exports to the United States and negotiated voluntary export restraints on the part of Japan. A final type of protectionism is called a non-tariff barrier. And this is kind of the catch-all category. A non-tariff barrier is a bureaucratic or regulatory barrier which is set up really for the purpose of restricting imports. You could imagine, for example, that maybe France would set up a rule that says all imported Japanese television sets must pass through one town located somewhere in the middle of France and be inspected one at a time. And a rule like that might take a long time, it might impose high costs, and it might act as a way of blocking imported televisions from Japan into France. So it's definitely possible to restrict imports. What are the economics of these kinds of restrictions? Well, protectionism definitely helps the industry that is being protected. No question about it. But consumers are going to pay the costs. Let's think about the situation of the industry that's being protected, first of all. The industry that's being protected doesn't face as much competition from foreign producers. As a result, it can charge higher prices and earn higher profits. Now, this statement should not be in any way controversial. I mean, after all, if the domestic industry couldn't charge higher prices and earn higher profits, then there isn't any point to shutting out the imported products in the first place. If it doesn't have an effect on domestic producers, if it doesn't benefit domestic producers, you might as well just let the imports come in. So it's obviously, ostentatiously true that firms that are protected can earn higher profits and charge higher prices. Well, someone pays those higher prices. Domestic consumers pay those higher prices. Thus, protectionism in economic terms is just a way for a government to provide an indirect subsidy to an industry. It's a set of rules that provide industry with an indirect subsidy, and that subsidy is paid for by higher consumer prices. Now, I've been saying consumer prices, but in some cases, like, say, steel, it might be other firms that are buying the product rather than consumers directly. And in that case, consumers ultimately would pay the higher price as the costs are passed along to them in a competitive marketplace. So overall, protectionism is a way for government to rig the market so that consumers of a certain product will pay more and industry will receive that money. If the government imposed a tax on consumption of a certain good so that everyone who consumed that good had to pay the tax, and the government took that money from consumers and gave it to the industry that produced the good, we would call that a direct subsidy. Through protectionism, Essentially, consumers are forced to pay more so that firms benefit, and so that's an indirect subsidy. But, the two situations are really extremely similar, forcing consumers to pay more so firms can have more money. Now, what are the arguments for why this kind of a subsidy to certain industries might make economic sense? Well, a lot of arguments have been made for protectionism. Some of them are more sensible than others, but let's run through the long list and take them one at a time. Many of the arguments for protectionism are about how it might benefit workers. Now, we need to unpack this a little bit because there are different ways and different issues in the labor market for how imports and the labor market might be interrelated. In particular, there are four possible effects here. One is that somehow imports might affect the total number of jobs. Another is that they might affect the average level of wages. Another is that they might create disruption from changing jobs, even if the total number of jobs is up. And another argument is that it might lead to greater inequality of wages, even if the average wage is up. So we need to sort of unpack those possible ways in which imports could affect jobs and look at them one at a time. Now, there's no question that protectionism is a subsidy that can help jobs within a certain industry. However, there is no reason at all to believe that protectionism increases the overall number of jobs in an economy. There's just zero evidence that international trade diminishes the total number of jobs. The most vivid illustration of this that some of you may have read about or dimly recall was when the North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico was being discussed in the mid-1990s, the early 1990s. And Ross Perot, who was arguing against the treaty, made a famous comment. He said, "If there's free trade between the United States and Mexico, there would be a giant sucking sound of jobs heading south." Well, the North American Free Trade Agreement passed in 1994. It was followed by 7 of the best years for job growth in U.S. history. The giant sucking sound didn't happen. There's strong economic theory suggesting trade should have very little to do with the overall employment level. Remember from back in the language of Lecture 21 when we talked about unemployment, that unemployment is either cyclical, which means it's tied to recession, or it's the natural rate of unemployment, which is tied to labor market institutions like unemployment benefits and rules about hiring. Either way, this is not about trade. To see the fallacy here, imagine that we just decided to shut out all imports. Would that solve unemployment? Well, of course not. I mean, other countries would retaliate. We would lose export jobs. Other countries wouldn't have U.S. dollars if they couldn't sell here. They couldn't buy exports. And the result at the end of the day would be that probably unemployment and employment would be much the same as before. Protectionism can redistribute jobs. It will certainly help industries that face import competition and hurt those that export, but there's no reason at all to believe that protectionism helps the overall number of jobs. After all, protectionism does not in any direct way address either the natural rate of unemployment or cyclical unemployment. What about protectionism shutting out imports as a way to keep wages high? Well, protectionism is a subsidy to industry. It can certainly help wages in the industry that is being protected. However, that doesn't mean higher wages for the economy as a whole. After all, higher wages in the one industry that's being protected are coming at the cost of higher prices for the good that's being produced for all the rest of the economy. So everyone else is, in effect, able to buy less. Ultimately, wages are going to depend on productivity, as we discussed back in Lecture 7. If trade increases productivity, as I argued that it does, then it will also increase average wages over time. Now, of course, the link between productivity and wages isn't immediate, but over time, productivity is by far the single largest determinant of wages. And if trade helps productivity, as I argued in the previous lecture, it should help average wages too. What about inequality? If we have more protectionism, could we somehow reduce the amount of inequality in the U.S. economy? Well, there's a big dispute over how much the rise in inequality of incomes that happened from the 1970s up into the mid-2000s has been caused by trade. And we talked about this some back in Lecture 16. The consensus seems to be that globalization does contribute somewhat to inequality, but it's not the biggest factor. Technology factors like information and communications technology are more important. So are institutional factors in the labor market, like the reduction in the power of unions, the reduction in minimum wages. Those are all things which have tended to contribute to the inequality of incomes. Globalization is just not the biggest compared to these. The mainstream estimate might be that globalization and more trade has caused something like 1/5 of the increase in inequality that's happened. The underlying issue here is, as we talked about in the previous lecture, that a lot of U.S. trade is with high-wage economies. And so that kind of trade is not going to contribute to inequality all that much. Only maybe 3% of GDP or so represents imports from low-wage economies, like, say, China and India. And that just isn't a big enough share of the entire economy to cause the shift in inequality that we've been observing. Indeed, about 2/3 of the jobs in the U.S. economy really don't compete with trade at all. I mean, if you're a lawyer, or you build houses, or you provide skilled nursing services, you can't outsource skilled nursing services to another country. They need to be provided in person. So there is inequality, there is an issue there, but trade isn't the main cause, and there are a lot of solutions other than restricting trade. There's also sometimes an argument that trade has contributed to an income gap, a growing gap between the richest and poorest countries of the world. We talked about this back in Lecture 20 on patterns of economic growth around the world. The rich countries of the world in the last century or so have been getting steadily and steadily richer. The poor countries, on the other hand, haven't really made very much progress at all since about 1870, so there's been a divergence in per capita GDP. But the wealth of the rich countries of the world is not built on keeping sub-Saharan Africa poor, or India poor, or Western China poor. Those places aren't poor because of trade. They aren't even involved in trade. If anything, they're poor because of a lack of trade. This rising gap in world incomes isn't because globalization is harming the poorest countries of the world, but because they aren't participating at all. The leading success stories in economic development, like South Korea and China, have actually used foreign trade as one of their main engines of growth. Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and certainly no raving free market economist, said in his speech accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, "The main losers in today's very unequal world are not those who are too exposed to globalization, but those who have been left out." What about other arguments for protectionism? It's sometimes argued that there are certain industries, called infant industries, that need to be sheltered from foreign competition for a time until they're ready to compete. And in theory, this argument could make sense. Perhaps if you helped an industry get well established and get large economies of scale, it could go out into the world and compete more effectively. But in practice, these infant industries usually become geriatric without ever getting ready to compete. And the economy suffers all along from supporting them. Let me give you a classic example. Brazil in the 1970s decided to start its own computer industry. And because its computer industry could not compete in the world economy, it shut out imported computers and gave lots of other subsidies to its computer industry. Well, by the later part of the 1980s, there was a Brazilian computer industry, but it was about 10 years behind the times, which in computer years is a long time behind the times. This wasn't only a problem for the computer industry. Think of all the other Brazilian industries that use computers, all the banking industries, the finance industries, the industrial uses of computers. And they're all trying to get by and survive in the world economy with computers that are essentially 10 years out of date. So you don't just end up with an outdated and uncompetitive computer industry, which would be bad enough. In effect, Brazil hobbled all of its other industries that would have liked to be using up-to-date computers. That's just a terrible, terrible economic policy. The best example of where infant industry policies have worked to some extent is probably South Korea. The rule there was, when they gave government subsidies to industry, was that if the industry didn't reach a certain level of international sales on a preset timeline, then all the protectionism and other government subsidies were cut off. So there was a hard edge there. And indeed, for certain industries, they did end up cutting off the subsidies. So I'd say if you have to have infant industry subsidies, you have to set goals for that industry. You have to say, if those goals aren't met, we're going to cut the subsidy off. And if you don't have the political power to do that, don't start the subsidies in the first place. It's also worth saying for South Korea and some of those other countries in East Asia that the fundamental reason for their